Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so glad to have you here with us today. Excuse me. So today I have Kevin Oakes with me. He's CEO and founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity, the leading human capital research company in the world, and he's author of Culture Renovation. It is currently sold out on Amazon, so make sure to go out there, get your order in so that when the book becomes available, you can get it as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Michelle. And the physical copies will be available at the end of next week, but the Kindle is always available. So if you're interested in reading the book, you can get it on Kindle right now. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is culture overall, but more specifically, if you want to change culture in an organization, how do you do it? And that's what this book is all about. And I am particularly thrilled to be talking to an L&D audience, which is how I grew up in the whole human capital industry, because L&D is such a big part of the equation to successful culture change. So just some quick little background on me. As I said, I grew up in the L&D space. I was on the ASTD, now ATD board for many years, was chairman of that board and a few other ASTD affiliated boards. I'm currently on the boards of a few different educational vendor companies such as Guild and EdCast, and that's the advisory boards of those organizations. And I have written another book in the past called Integrated Talent Management. It's the executive guide to that ASTD had published. So that's just a little bit on me. Let me tell you a little bit about my organization, because I'm going to guess that some of you aren't familiar with us. The Institute for Corporate Productivity, which we shorten to I4CP, is doing more human capital research than just about anyone on the planet. And our research is all focused on the people practices that drive high performance. And that term, high performance, is a very important term to us. When we use the term high performance, we're really talking about organizations that have better revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And so my research team is looking at all kinds of data and correlating it to those high performing organizations versus low performing organizations, and looking at what do they do differently and what specific practices are correlating to that bottom line business impact. And so we come up with a lot of best practices, but what we hang our hat on are next practices, and those are specific practices that we can see are correlated, but not a lot of companies have yet implemented them. And you can see the snapshot of the kinds of companies we work with. You'll recognize most of these organizations. This is a partial list of some of the companies that are part of our network. And several of these I'll reference in the presentation because we profiled them in the book. And so let me get to the book real quick. So the book is called Culture Renovation, just came out less than a month ago. 18 leadership actions to build an unshakable company. I've gotten some great response to the book. It's been the #1 new release on Amazon in many different categories like HR, or workplace culture, or organizational learning even. And also gotten some great support from authors like Brene Brown, who is her quote's on the cover. But Tom Rath wrote the foreword for the book. Marshall Goldsmith, Dan Pink, they've all been very, very supportive of this notion of culture renovation, because it's a topic that they feel very passionate about as well. And I think it's a topic that's very in the news these days. I speak with a lot of different companies every week, and many organizations are concerned about their culture. And what I tell organizations is, whether you like it or not, during the pandemic, the culture of the organization has changed. There have been positive changes. I hear a lot about the fact that companies have expressed more empathy to employees and flexibility than ever before, and many employees are getting a window into the personal lives of their coworkers and even senior management through mechanisms like we're on today. But there's been some negative impact as well. The pandemic has caused people to feel disconnected, sometimes lonely, we've kind of lost serendipity, and where creativity comes from in those casual encounters that happen sometimes in the office. And so there's been a lot written about culture from that perspective, and I think the book hits at an interesting time for culture. But it also hits at an interesting time from just from an organizational perspective. Many boards of directors are looking at the topic of culture with new eyes and trying to have more introspection on organizational culture. In fact, before I came on to join you guys, was talking with the CEO of a large bank, and he was talking about how their board is beginning to look at the topic of culture more keenly, and I'm going in to present to that board of directors soon. And boards are getting advice from folks like the NACD, which is the largest association for corporate directors. And the advice they're getting from the NACD is that oversight of corporate culture should be among one of the top governance imperatives for every board. That was a quote that came out of a report that the NACD put out called Culture as a Corporate Asset, which is a great report. And we've worked with many of the authors of that report who are sitting directors on boards and have explored this issue in depth. In fact, one of those directors is Jamie Gorelick. She sits on the board of Amazon and VeriSign, I believe. And one quote that she had in in the book and in the study is that her clients, which are corporate boards, they want to know if they're sitting on quicksand, and they want to know how well the company is run and the spirit of the company. And she's saying that really in the context of many of the scandals that we're all familiar with, whether it was a Wells Fargo sales scandal or a Boeing 737 MAX scandal, or you've probably read a lot about the WeWork culture over time, or other cultures. We've seen a lot of scandals hit that are attributed to organizational culture. We've also seen in many industries competitors rise up out of nowhere. And most of you are probably familiar with the term unicorn, but if you're not, that refers to a private company that has a valuation of $1 billion or more. And the term unicorn was only invented about 7 or 8 years ago. And at the time it was invented, there were maybe 40 unicorns in the world. Today, there's well over 500 private companies with a valuation of $1 billion or more. And what's interesting about unicorns is they all have the same thing in common. They're trying to disrupt a staid industry or staid companies. And they're disrupting through new business models, through new technology, or both. But the reason unicorns are important for organizations to think about is because they are probably the biggest threat to many organizations who are looking at, a business model that they've relied on for some time, and are increasingly concerned that business model is going to get disrupted by one of these organizations. In fact, things change very, very quickly, as I'm sure most of you know. 2 decades ago, you can see the list of the top or most valuable companies in the world. Today, that list is dominated mostly by technology companies, and actually my order here is a little off because these companies keep switching. But there's one company that has stayed on this list over that time period, and that's Microsoft. And Microsoft is a company I like talking about because they're a great case study in culture renovation, and it's a company we work with quite a bit. You may remember that back in the early 2000s through like the 2010 to 2014 timeframe, there was a lot of talk about the fact that Microsoft had lost its mojo, and some people had predicted Microsoft would go the way of Sears. Well, when Steve Ballmer stepped down as CEO, and announced he was stepping down, and they did a CEO search, they found the perfect person in Satya Nadella, who had been in the organization for many years. And what you're seeing here in this picture is the 3 CEOs that Microsoft has ever had: Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Satya Nadella. And Satya is a fascinating individual. I'm a big fan of Satya because one of the very first things he said in his very first annual shareholder meeting is that our ability to change our culture is going to be the leading indicator of our future success. And as many of you may have read, he rallied the company around the concept of growth mindset as part of that culture change. And growth mindset comes out of the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. And it's really the notion that individuals can improve. As an L&D community, you all know this inherently, I'm sure. But also that you can learn from mistakes, that mastery is not innate, and we can improve our capabilities over time. And Satya has been such a big fan of growth mindset. They have a lot of reminders about what that means inside the organization. And I'm completely impressed with people in Microsoft when I talk to them about this. Doesn't matter what level they are. Most employees can tell you about growth mindset top to bottom. And part of that is because they have reminders of it all around the company. This is a poster that's in a lot of conference rooms that says, is this going to be a fixed mindset meeting, or is this going to be a growth mindset meeting? And then bullet points underneath each to tell you what that really means overall. Many people inside Microsoft, when they put together presentations, they use quotes from Satya. He's a very quotable CEO. But I love this quote from him. If you're going to have a risk-taking culture, you can't really look at every failure as a failure. You've got to be able to look at that failure as a learning opportunity. And he really lives that. Some of you may remember this, although I find a lot of people don't remember it because it wasn't around that long. Microsoft had created an AI chatbot called Tay for Twitter, which was a chatbot that allowed people to teach Tay answers to particular questions. Well, humans being humans, we immediately taught Tay how to swear and say every swear word in the book and a number of racist things. And Tay had a lifespan of 16 hours before Microsoft had to pull it down. Now, Microsoft had spent a lot of money, millions, on developing Tay, and there was a huge team of people that created Tay. And many CEOs would have been furious that this team did not see this coming ahead of time. Well, Satya, as you probably have guessed, took it a different way. And he looked at this as a way for him to have a learning moment with the team. And so he sent them out a very encouraging email that the key is to keep learning and improving, and that he's got their back, basically. Despite that criticism that they had with Tay. Now, I love this chart because I get asked a lot of times, does culture really translate to performance? And I'm a huge believer that it does. Excuse me. As you can see, when Satya took over as CEO, back in 2014, to today, he built the company to become one of the most valuable companies in the world. And I really believe that culture had a big part to do with that. Now, he and the team have been very successful at changing culture overall. And that's notable because culture change is hard. In fact, only 15% of companies that set out to do it are successful at changing culture. And so we wanted to set out from a research perspective and figure out why. And we looked at over 7,000 organizations, and we went into this research study around culture change, trying to understand, is there a commonality between companies who are successful? Is there a blueprint that they follow, or blueprint that we could create out of their success? And that's exactly what we found. We were able to create 18 action steps that very successful companies followed in order to have successful culture change, and that's what's documented in this book. And so those 18 steps are segmented into 3 phases. The phases are plan, build, and maintain, kind of keeping with the culture theme, with many real-life corporate examples and then interviews with a lot of world-class CEOs and CHROs. Now, we start out the book talking about the fact that there are traits of a healthy culture. And the top line are high performance organizations. The bottom line are low performance organizations. And you can see by and large, high performance organizations are going to say they have these healthy culture traits inside their organization, except for the last one. Are we a top down command and control organization? In fact, you can see, a couple here that I'm sure, stick out to you as being very L&D focused around viewing failure as an opportunity to learn and grow, or nurturing innovative thinking, and its application. These are tenets that I think many healthy cultures have. So I'm going to just give you a couple highlights from those 18 steps in those 3 phases. We'll start with the plan phase, and there are 6 steps in each phase. And in the plan phase, one of the things that we talk about is that the CEO really needs to be the culture champion, much like Satya was in Microsoft. What we find in successful companies is the CEO not only spearheads culture change, but is extremely supportive of it and has that commitment and time and resources to see it through. But before they begin to try to act on changing the culture, they do a very smart thing, and they listen to the workforce to really understand workforce sentiment. It's amazing to me how many companies don't do this, but successful companies, they recognize they probably don't know what all the aspects of culture are inside the organization, or what some of those issues are. So they're using sort of always-on listening technology through natural language processing and a little bit of AI and machine learning as part of that, or they're simply pulsing the workforce on a weekly basis. Some are doing it on a daily basis, so that they can weed out the false positives that the annual employment engagement survey will often give to you, and really look at the ongoing issues that are inside the organization. Once you have that sense, it's important to try to figure out who are the influencers and energizers in the organization. You're all very familiar with the hierarchy structure, but that's not the way workflow actually happens. The way workflow and collaboration happens is through a network structure. And even though you've got somebody at the top whose name is mayors, when you look at the network structure through organizational network analysis, you quickly understand that Mitchell is the person that everybody seems to go to, influences many inside the organization, yet Mitchell is buried in the organizational chart. And oftentimes these people are introverts, not extroverts. And so until you really analyze what is the workflow, you're not going to know who the Mitchells are inside your organization. We also found that successful organizations defined the measures that they were going to use around success up front. In fact, 2/3 of the successful companies did this up front. 90% who are unsuccessful did not do this. There's a lot of ways that you can measure culture. I'd be happy to share some of those with you. And there's also, I'll give you a website at the end that has some of that information. That's part of the plan phase. I'll go through the next 2 relatively quickly because I know we want to have a little bit of time for questions. But in the build phase, one of the toughest steps is to ferret out the skeptics or the non-believers early. We found that almost 40% of companies who were successful replaced senior leaders who were not willing or able to embrace the change. And this is oftentimes one of the toughest steps out of those 18 steps. They also spent a lot of time making sure that all leaders inside the company really modeled the behaviors that they wanted inside the organization. And so they provided training at the senior level, but also mid-level and frontline leaders as well, to a much greater extent than companies that weren't successful at all. So this is a great slide to show internally if anybody's skeptical on, should we spend time and energy on training our leaders? In the book, we also talk about the importance of stories and symbols. Those will really sort of shortcut, some of the values you're trying to, implant inside the organization. It's taking words on a PowerPoint and making it much more memorable. And so I spent quite a bit of time in the book talking about companies that had very effective stories or very effective symbols to make their culture come to life. Last thing I'll go into is the maintain phase. And these are a lot of talent practices that people put into place inside the organization to make sure that culture change sticks. If you don't do this, it's very easy to just kind of revert back to the way things were. And so onboarding is where you start. We found that successful companies looked at onboarding not as an exercise around forms and getting your laptop or your badge. It's more about how can we set up relationships inside the organization that will help you be successful long term and introduce you to those subject matter experts that are going to help you develop as a person and your career. We found that many organizations that change culture also change performance management. They were serious about trying to say to the organization, here's how we're going to measure performance going forward. So we're going to change the way we've been doing it. There's a lot of different ways that people have changed their performance management process, but just the sheer fact that they have changed it is what you should take away from that. And the last one that I'll focus on is talent mobility, one of my favorite subjects. Not a lot of companies put a lot of energy into talent mobility, but we find that companies who move talent around the organization and are good about promoting internal talent typically are high-performing organizations. And even though managers, their tendency is to hoard talent, if I've got good people underneath me, I don't want them going anywhere. The companies that recognize and reward managers for developing and moving talent tend to be higher performing organizations. And those managers tend to become talent magnets once people recognize that they're going to help me in my career. So talent mobility is a very important concept, I think, in culture change overall. So I'll stop there. We have a website at culturerenovation.com where you can get more information about what I just said. You'll get more information about the book. There are some different tools available as well at culturerenovation.com. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I'm talking a lot about culture renovation these days. But let me pause there and just see if we have any questions.
Well, great. Thank you, Kevin. And any questions that you guys have for Kevin as we're going through here? So the one thing that I did really like, Kevin, as you were going through and talking about stuff was really that piece on the talent mobility and really, how do you help your people grow instead of, really forcing them out of your organizations because you're not investing that time in them or really showing them that they have a path forward with the organization.
Yeah, it's again, I said talent mobility is not really utilized by a lot of companies, in my opinion, to its fullest extent. We found probably less than 20% of companies measure talent mobility or talk about it quite a bit inside their organizations. And I think it's an underutilized development strategy for many companies. I highly recommend companies looking at how do we encourage more talent mobility, because there's so many ancillary benefits of it from a communication standpoint, particularly for your high potential employees. Talent mobility can be a very critical mechanism to keep those employees engaged inside the company.
Yep, and we had a comment from Jay that he really loved the blueprint motif. And a question from John is, did you see culture change less likely at highly regulated businesses?
I think it can be a little bit more challenging in highly regulated businesses, but it's culture change is something that every company, no matter the industry, no matter if you're a for-profit or nonprofit, you really should make sure that you are paying attention to culture inside the organization. That's why I started out by saying, during the pandemic, your culture changed, like it or not. Do you want to be proactive about what the culture should be going forward, or are you going to be reactive about it overall as an organization?
Yeah, and Noel had asked, how long did the transformation take at Microsoft? So Noel, hit refresh. He goes through and talks about what that process was for Microsoft, how long that took, and a little bit more detail there. And Allison from the Kara Group had asked, what are some best next practices you're seeing onboarding that build relationships as companies pivot to virtual onboarding?
Again, using that organizational network analysis philosophy, you can track how individuals are managing relationships going forward, and are they working. I spent an entire chapter on this inside the organization, inside the book, I should say. We also run a separate group called the Connected Commons, which is all about organizational network analysis. And that group is managed by Rob Cross. He's a professor at Babson. He's kind of the father of this whole movement. And Rob is a business partner, and we do a lot of work together around this science of organizational network analysis.
Very good. And I put that link there. Any other questions that you guys have? Okay, so Noelle asked, Google has a talent mobility program called Chameleon. Any thoughts on it?
I don't know much about it specifically, but we are working with Google, so I'll try to dive into that now.
All right. And other thoughts, comments that you guys have? Okay, while we wait for some questions to come up, I will just say for sure, go ahead and get the Kindle book, and then you get the discount through Amazon sometimes of ordering the audiobook or getting a discount on the paper copy. Well worth the read, and you will have bookmarked pages like crazy as you go through. There's lots of insights, and what I really liked as we were going through the book is you didn't make it this very much, just so high level art of the possible that people couldn't get their arms around, like, what do I do? You gave very practical beginning steps that people could take.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. It's great to talk to somebody who has actually read the book. And that was what we set out to do, right? Was make this practical and tactical. It's always concerned me that a lot of books on culture were too strategic or ethereal to be helpful to organizations. And most of the CEOs I talk to, or CHROs, they ask a pretty simple question. I get the importance of culture, but how do we do it? How do we make impact here? How do we make changes? And even on Microsoft, that question about how long did it take? What Microsoft will tell you is we're not done. This never stops, right? This continues. And in fact, I end the book that way. This is an ongoing process. They've made tremendous progress in a very short period of time, but they'll tell you very frankly and honestly, we've got lots of issues that we want to solve for and that we're not happy about. And so they're continuing to work on their culture renovation.
Yeah, and I liked the case studies as you went through, kind of picked up on that willingness to kind of dive deep and not think about, okay, well, this is our culture and it's a very, static thing, and rather than recognizing that, it's dynamic. So those organizations who are really like, this is a dynamic thing, it shows up in how our behaviors as people come to work, the processes that they're engaging in, what their clients are really wanting and asking for, and kind of bringing all of that together.
Correct.
And we got a couple of comments. Sold. I'm getting the book today.
All right. Well, Amazon will be back in stock with a physical book at the end of next week, but there might be books out on some other sites. So best of luck.
Well, any other questions that you guys have? If you don't, we will be making this available to you on our L&D Cares channel. And Kevin, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you've got your Wharton podcast that you just did, the Brené Brown one. So even if you guys can't get the book, there's lots of great podcasts out there. And we really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, everybody. Hope this was helpful.